So here we are talking about diarrhea still. John wanted to make sure for me to point out that I've decided to take a break and do a little hair restyling for this next format. This is just a coincidence, but I've always thought, I'll get out of the way here in a second, that another way that we can write this problem is diarrhea. So I don't know if that's even funny, but I'll sit down and keep talking. So we've talked about antispasmodics, carrier and flavoring agents, and antiparasiticals. There's a few other components to talk about. One of them is just bitters. Often during diarrhea, so this is really, most of these are really about infectious diarrhea. If it's a food allergy, your goal is to remove the triggers really. If it's a stress-induced diarrhea, the goal is to give nervines to relax the nervous system. So a lot of these are really about infectious diarrhea where you have something in you and you're trying to push it out or alter the system. So one of the kinds of medicines to use during infectious diarrhea are bitters. Some of these bitters can be taken over a long period of time, and some of them should be taken shorter amounts of times because it's just harder on the body. So some of them include the sage brushes. So Artemisia species, sagebrush, is a good bitter. The bitters help stimulate gastric secretions, some of the acids, some of the enzymes that are released. And it seems like for some people this helps improve their symptoms and maybe somehow works on killing the infectious organisms. The next is bog bean. Bog bean, the genus is Menianthes, and it's a gentian family member. It's just a beautiful plant. So bog bean, Menianthes, another bitter you can take. Sometimes these are good in the restorative phase. Sometimes they're not the things that kill things, but they just help. You can take these along with other herbs to promote the killing of the organisms and also sometimes to improve the function of your GI tract while you have diarrhea. Chaparro amargosa itself is very bitter, but that would combine both bitter and antiparasitical. Chicory and dandelion are good bitters. And then one of my favorites is gentian. So there's a lot of species of gentian, but you can take gentian while you're sick and post being sick to help restore function of your GI tract from diarrheas. Really, when it's, again, infectious diarrhea. But gentian itself is a plant that you can take for a longer period of time. Gentian is safer than, let's say, sage brushes. They can be taken for weeks at least. During the diarrhea, after diarrhea, to see if you can get your function going, if your function doesn't get restored right away. You might also include astringent herbs. So after a bout of nasty infectious diarrhea, as opposed to kind infectious diarrhea, sometimes you might want to add an astringent, usually tea or tincture, but teas probably work better here, to help restore the architecture. So this is really, especially something like Shigella, where the Shigella bacteria, I haven't differentiated these, it won't happen in this class, but something like the Shigella bacteria actually disrupts the tissue. That's why with Shigella, you sometimes have blood in your stools. So with the organisms that affect, the infectious organisms that actually affect the tissue in the intestine, sometimes astringents afterwards help restore the tissue function. And I've already discussed astringents, some of the specific astringents useful. This is usually, by the way, post-diarrhea. So you've had diarrhea, and now you might have a little bit of diarrhea left, but your function just still isn't back as well. So some things like rhatany or crumeria, agrimony, geranium root, and one specific one to consider here. So those are some astringents I've talked about previously, but another astringent that sometimes is really nicely toning post-diarrhea, it could be done towards the end of the diarrhea and during post-problem, is yellow dock root. So yellow dock is something I could talk about a lot, but I just want to say for it here that by yellow dock, I mean Rumex crispus and Rumex obtusifolius. They're very bitter, so you also have your bitter category. So yellow dock covers 3 categories, which is nice here. It's also a pretty safe herb. So it's astringent, and it's bitter, and it also seems to be digestive toning. For whatever it does, it seems to help restore tone beyond astringency to your GI tract. So what I'm saying is if you've had bad diarrhea and then you just don't feel well afterwards, or maybe your stools are looser or you still have urgency, I would consider using yellow dock either as a tea, very strong tasting, I made a face to it, or as a tincture, and take it regularly. Small amounts work, so maybe you're going to decoct the root. It's the root that's used. So you can decoct the root and drink like a quarter cup twice a day, not a lot, or maybe take 1 dropper full of the tincture twice a day as a restorative. So it fits into the bitter category and fits into a restorative category for diarrhea. Another plant that can just fit into this whole milieu here of diarrhea is just peppermint. Many people really like the flavor of peppermint. So peppermint, there are 3 ways to prepare it here, and one I want to talk about specifically. So peppermint is a digestive relaxant. For many people, after they drink peppermint tea, the tension, so it's not an antispasmodic, but the tension they feel and the pain gets reduced a little bit. So peppermint is a great digestive aid. Peppermint is just really helpful to have. There are 3 forms you can have with you. The first is just tea. Peppermint dries pretty well and makes a nice tasting tea. But if you're going to make a tea, steep the peppermint leaves for just about 2 minutes. If you steep the peppermint leaves longer than 2 minutes in hot, hot water, it becomes more astringent and less tasty. So peppermint does have a use, cooked or steeped longer, but if you just want the flavor, take them out after 1 or 2 minutes, and you'll have a more pepperminty flavor and not so much an astringent tasting brew. The next thing is peppermint spirits. So peppermint spirits is going to cover a couple of different bases and is important here. Peppermint spirits is my favorite anti-nauseant and thing to help quell vomiting. So I've been talking about these specific categories and jumping around a bit at the same time, and I'm jumping around a little more, and I want to talk about peppermint spirits. A spirit is an essential oil in alcohol. So peppermint spirits is basically peppermint essential oil in an alcohol base. And generally it looks like something like this, like 1 part peppermint essential oil to 20 parts 50% ethanol, 50% alcohol. 1 part peppermint essential oil to 20 parts alcohol. And usually about 50% works. So that means if you have 1 ounce of peppermint essential oil, it's going to go in 20 ounces of 50% ethanol. So it's really simple. So here's your almost a quart of tincture, 20 ounces as opposed to 32 ounces. Here's your peppermint essential oil. Pour that ounce in there. It's done. It's still pretty strong tasting, and peppermint spirits, which is peppermint essential oil in alcohol, is very strong, and it smells good, and it tastes okay, but it can also be stomach upsetting because it's just that much essential oil internally can just really upset stomachs as well as help. So the important thing is it's a drop dose medicine. More doesn't help at all. By the way, it really just basically tastes like Lifesavers. It's pretty tasty that way. It basically tastes like menthol. So I use it for a couple of reasons. The first way that I use it, though, is I've talked all about this vomiting and diarrhea, and I haven't talked about how to try to stop the vomiting. There's not that many ways. Partly it's just avoiding things that create more vomiting, like not putting stuff in people's mouths. But peppermint spirits sometimes works well. When you do it, so peppermint spirits, peppermint essential oil, and alcohol, you actually put a drop on their lip, right? Or you put a gloved hand and put a drop on your finger and rub it on their lip. So if they're actively vomiting, it's easy to initiate a gag reflex. If they're currently vomiting, almost anything you do can get them to vomit more. So you want to be really careful to not have people vomit, right? It just, if nothing else, it feels harsh, right? And at this point, probably they're vomiting bile. It's just a really rough kind of vomiting. So initially, just put a drop of the peppermint essential oil on their lip. They can put it on their finger on their lip if their hands are clean, or clean Q-tip and put it on their lip. And sometimes it just really relaxes the gut and will reduce nausea and vomiting, which are different instances. So peppermint essential oil is something I always carry. It also just feels good for stomach aches. Like my stomach hurts, peppermint spirits. once again, in that situation, without vomiting, just give a drop or two. You can also put a drop or two in water. I'm telling you, it's strong. Excuse me. People smell it, and like, oh, that smells great, and they take a couple of drops. It just hurts. It's just too much essential oil. You can also, by the way, dilute it 1 to 30, 1 to 40. I mean, you can play with the peppermint spirits. Since it's an essential oil in alcohol, it's not going to go bad. So I also like to make it a little stronger, and what I've been doing is making peppermint tea and peppermint tincture and adding those two together and then adding the peppermint essential oil. So I make a strong peppermint tea, but I take that peppermint out quick. So it's mostly peppermint flavored. I tincture dried peppermint. So I make a peppermint tincture with dried peppermint leaves, fresh dried, gather fresh peppermint, dry it, and tincture it. I add the tea and the tincture together, so it's 50%, and then I add the peppermint essential oil, and that is a really very pepperminty, useful medicine for just relaxing the gut, and also one of the few things that sometimes will quell the vomiting. Because once the vomiting's done, you can give people herbs internally. But you have to start slowly. So still on vomiting. They've stopped vomiting. Initially, somebody has stopped vomiting. They've been vomiting. Now they can start drinking. Start really, really slow and just water. Even before your rehydration fluid, give some water. So they just basically take a very small sip of water and wait 5 or 10 minutes and then take another small sip. This is right after they finish vomiting until they're sure they're not going to start gagging again. I've seen many times where people stop vomiting, they drink a cup of water and vomit it out and then start the whole condition again. There are, by the way, if you read about it, some emergency medical ways of trying to get water in people who are dehydrating. One of them is through the rectum with a turkey baster. But I don't really want to go into those details because most of you won't be in that situation. But I'm just saying dehydration is a medical emergency at one point. So once they stop vomiting, slow amounts of water, and then your rehydration fluids, and then as I've talked about, maybe some oatmeal when they can eat, or slippery elm gruel, then some soups, and eventually solid foods. So I want to reiterate some of the things I've covered so far. So we've talked about diarrhea, causes of diarrhea, separating acute from chronic, separating infectious from non-infectious, talking about rehydration fluids, spending some time discussing the medical implications for vomiting with diarrhea, discussing how diarrhea is a natural aspect of the body initially trying to get rid of bacteria. And then I've covered antiparasitical herbs, antispasmodic herbs, astringents and bitters, carriers. I've discussed things that are relaxing to the GI tract like catnip and chamomile, meadowsweet. And those are some of the main categories used here. So I hope that you have a sense of herbs, some of the herbs to have on hand. For some of the, by the way, for some of the infectious diarrheas, you can also try some of the classic plants. So I've focused on antiparasiticals, but I do want to say that if you're not sure what's causing the infectious diarrhea, you could also just try kind of your standard antibacterials. Oregon grapefruit is one of my favorite. Oregon grapefruits or the berberis or Mahonia species. If I'm not sure what else it is and I don't have Chaparro amargosa, it's my go-to plant, right? So maybe along with garlic on the side, Oregon grapefruits. Golden seal is really helpful here. So golden seal tincture, Oregon grapefruit tincture, as standard over kind of antimicrobials covering a broad base of problems. Yarrow and OSHA can be helpful here as antimicrobials. And don't forget that sometimes adding demulcents will just make the gut feel better. One demulcent to consider post-diarrhea is calendula, as calendula kills some stuff and helps restore tissue tone. So also, you just might want to consider some of your standard demulcents just to feel good in your belly after it's been disrupted. And two that really work well are marshmallow root and slippery elm powder. So marshmallow root, you can also, by the way, get marshmallow root powder. I buy that. It's really hard to powder it yourself. And slippery elm powder. You just stir them in water and drink it. And don't make it too thick a gruel. I've just discussed diarrhea and some of the treatments for diarrhea. I hope you get an understanding, like a take-home experience of what to look for in diarrhea, ways to assess diarrhea, and some of the ways of treating this really common ailment. Thank you.